Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to have a look at Lithuania as a country for their ground vehicles. If you didn't see yesterday in the winter event leaks, we had the Vilkes, which is an IFV for Lithuania, and I thought why not have a look at some of their other stuff they have. Turns out they don't really have too much stuff, but they do have some interesting stories for some of their vehicles. So, what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the vehicles we could see for good old Lithuania. Mainly some artillery stuff, but definitely some interesting, more mobile ideas as well for their special forces. Now, the interesting thing about Lithuania is they don't have any MBTs, but in 2023, in July, they did actually put out a letter of intent to the Germans to buy the Leopard II. So technically, they could have access to a Leopard II. Basically, Arvydas Anusaukas, who is the Minister for National Defense, announced the selection over social media on the 28th of July. Where basically they said that they want the Leopard 2 MBT. The interesting thing is we don't know which Leopard 2 that Lithuania is going to get, but they are going to get a Leopard 2. So there could be a bit of creative freedom here when it comes to it. And also, since it's the first vehicle, or the first MBT, I should say, that Lithuania is going to get access to, it is actually kind of an interesting, idea. It's a monumental part of their history, at least the armed forces side, meaning that it is their first real MBT. Now, one thing that Lithuania does have is a lot of fast-wheeled vehicles, and one of them is the Land Rover Defender. The Land Rover is one of these vehicles which has been produced a massive amount and is actually used in a bunch of different militaries across the world, not just the United Kingdom, but also in places like Australia and even Albania and Turkey and also Italy. It's also used in Lithuania for their special forces, meaning that they have a specific variant which is a bit hyped up and also can be equipped with a 50 cal, meaning that you could run around with it. The Land Rovers, the basic differences between the standard Land Rovers that you see and the militarized ones is the militarized ones have a stronger chassis, but also at the same time they have different engines. So depending on which ones you get, it really depends on how much engine power you have. You have the ones which have the 300 TDI engines, and then you also have ones which have the TD5 in them instead. And the basic difference is the amount of power that they have. The TD5 engine gives an extra 200 brake horsepower on the vehicle, and that's the most standard one that is used nowadays, meaning that that is probably the one that is moved in. The Land Rover has been through so many different iterations, and definitely in the future could be in a lot of other places. As I said, in the Italian army, which would be quite fun, but also Lithuania does use them. They don't just use British wheeled vehicles, they also use American, in the form of the good old Humvee, or the High Mobility Multipurpose Wheeled Vehicle from the United States. This vehicle has been built so many times. I think there's nearly like 300,000 of these things around the place, and any different variant you can think of in the world has existed, whether it's AT, AA, standard reconnaissance, radar installations have even been put on these things, but I believe Lithuania just uses more standard ones with good old 50 cals on them. The fact is they don't have their own indigenous version of the Humvee, so they will just use the standard ones that they get, and there's over 200 of them in service in Lithuania, which shouldn't be a surprise since so many nations have access to the Humvee, and even some nations which are not seen as states, such as the Islamic State has of course 2,000 of them, thanks to some unfortunate happenings. The general thing about Lithuania, though, is this could easily be one where it turns up with once again a 50 cal, or maybe a grenade launcher, or just something a little bit fun, since they use it for special forces operations. Lithuania also uses a ton of M113s, and the M113s obviously could have a 50 cal on them, maybe something else, but the one I want to focus on is a mortar carrier version. Basically, it has a 120mm mortar in it, so you could basically use it for top-down attack stuff while wandering around in the M113. It would be about as useful as a tow launcher one, maybe give it a 50 cal to give it a bit of support. Artillery pieces is also where Lithuania has some interesting stuff, starting off with the Caesar. This is, of course, the French artillery piece. It has access to a 155mm cannon on it, and it's basically a truck with a big gun. So that's how it's set up. It can be set up on many different chassis. Basically, the French use it on the Renault Sherpa 5 chassis, but exported, it actually uses a Unimog chassis or a Tatra chassis. So that is probably the ones used by good old Lithuania. The gun itself is obviously a 155mm, it's a 52 caliber, and this thing has only been in service since the late 2000s and being designed in the 90s. So this thing is very new compared to a lot of other artillery pieces that we've seen. The other thing about it is the fact that it can be set up super quickly. So in game, you could technically just remove that. It only takes about 60 seconds for the crew to be ready to fire after coming to a stop, and then 40 seconds to leave after shots. And it can also fire 6 rounds per minute, giving it a reload of 10 seconds, which ain't too much. This is actually used by a bunch of different nations. The Lithuanians specifically use the Mark II version of the vehicle, along with France and also Belgium, showing that they use one which is maybe a little bit more modern compared to some other nations which move around. The Lithuanians also use one of the more highly anticipated vehicles when it comes to the artillery genre in War Thunder, the Panza Haubitz 2000. So they don't just use French artilleries, they also use German ones. And this Panzer Haubitz, obviously developed in Germany, has been spread across the world in many different variants. Another very modern one, which basically has been in service since the late 90s and is used by a ton of different countries in Europe to kind of supplement their forces. Lithuania is one of them. They have about 21 of them, I believe, that they kind of go around with, and it's one of the smaller sets of vehicles compared to most nations, but still completely fine. The vehicle itself has a 155mm Rheinmetall L52 artillery gun. It has a loader, which means that it has a quick load or a sustained load, so basically a burst fire mode and then a sustained mode, which is quite nice. The actual loading system itself is really interesting, and I would highly recommend having a look into it, since it is such a large machine and has, of course, access to a pretty big ammo rack. It is pretty cool to see how it is loaded. The vehicle also has a good engine, the MTU 881, 986 horsepower, means that it has a very respectable power to weight ratio and can technically be used in direct fire too. Since this vehicle also is incredibly modern and in service today, it has a really interesting selection of rounds, and also at the same time, export wise, it does actually have some pretty cool vehicles that it is similar to. Finland is one of those which tested the Panzer Haubitz and also tested the Zuzana 155mm, which is a Slovakian artillery system, which is one we'll get into later on. The Lithuanians also use the Avenger, or the ANTWQ-1 Avenger. This is I suppose an air defense system which is set up on a Humvee, and it's actually pretty cool as a general vehicle. It is just a Stinger set of launchers sat on the back of a Humvee chassis. So you get access to 8 Stingers in sets of 4 in their launchers, and the vehicle itself also has access to a few other things depending on the variant which is around the place. There was a Avenger variant that could fire star streaks of all things, which I think is actually pretty cool, but the one that the Lithuanians use is part of their air defense battalion, and I think more of the standard one compared to others. Since it is a Humvee at the end of the day, it has a Detroit diesel in it, has 135 horsepower, it can motor around the place at a very good click, and also can obviously go after a lot of targets with it. More designed to go after stuff like helicopters, and obviously other stuff such as even cruise missiles and aircraft and drones. But we'll have to see how its effectiveness would set up in War Thunder. Since we already have the missile system, just not on the Humvee chassis, I feel like we already know how it would go. I'd just like to thank Brendan Quinn, Vilneus, Character Fuel, Juan the Panda, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, Bareen, Peter Grayling, Alan Hacker, Sem Alslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R., and also Lafouche for supporting the channel.